Hey again. In this video, I want to talk about one of my favorite topics in mythology. Basically, stories having to do with water spirits. Mythological beings, spirits, fairies, whatever you want to call them, that live in the water, whether it's the ocean or ponds or rivers or what have you. Most of us, of course, are familiar with mermaids and mermen. I mean, as being the prime example of spirits that live in the water, in the sea. Of course, we know them as human from the waist up and tail from the waist down. But the funny thing though is that water beings that appear in mythology, most of the time they seem to be pretty human looking. They have legs. The only difference between them and us is that they're not mortal. They're not human. And especially in Europe, they tend to be pretty dangerous. You really should be careful to stay away from bodies of water because a lot of times these spirits, they're usually portrayed mostly as female, and they're known for luring men to a watery death, basically, a watery grave. When we think of this type of story, the quintessential example is the Sirens from the epic The Odyssey by Homer. These are spirits that live on a little island in the Mediterranean, and with their beautiful song, they lure men to crash their ships into the islands. The funny thing, though, the only problem with that is that the sirens are actually bird-like beings. They're not what you think of when you think of mermaids. They're actually bird-like beings. But over time, I guess in the popular imagination, they've kind of transformed into mermaids. So when you think of sirens, you think of them as mermaids. But originally they were not. Usually with these stories, there's several type of endings. Usually, the guy drowns, lured to a watery death by these spirits. Other times, the guy lives, but is an unwilling captive under the water, and other times they're actually kind of happy. Perhaps they're like willing participants to have a lover in the form of a water being. For example, I think of one story from Cornwall. For example, in this book, for example, this is one of the early books I read that really turned me on to the idea of mythological stories of water spirits. Here's a typical mermaid with her column and stuff by the ocean, and the very first story is a really nice story about a Cornish. It's a beautiful illustration right here. That's Lutey and the mermaid. The guy's name is Lutey, and the mermaid. He meets this mermaid, and she gives him various wishes, and then she tries to take him with her. Well, she goes, "Why don't you stay with me?" And he pulls out a knife, and she lets him go. It wasn't so much the knife that bothered her; it was the fact that when it comes to pagan spirits, iron they don't seem to like. And she says to him, she goes, "Okay, well, you got away from me now, but 9 years from now, you're going to be mine." So sure enough, nine years go by, and when he sees her again, he goes to her and he disappears under the waves, and stays with her. Whether or not he regretted it, we don't really know, at least according to the story. So here's an example of a quasi-happy ending. And of course, if you have a lover that's a water spirit, you could somehow breathe underwater. This story of a water spirit that lures people down in the depths of the sea or the river or the lake has a lot of it fascinates a lot of writers. For example, there's a fairly modern story, Italian story. I'll have it in the description below. I forget the author's name, but it's an Italian who wrote a story. The English title is called The Professor and the Siren. Again, we use the term siren, but it's a mermaid. About a relationship between a scholar who meets a mermaid. It's a very interesting short story, and even H.G. Wells, the great sci-fi writer who gave us War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. He wrote a lesser-known novel called The Sea Lady, which a lot of people haven't read. I read it, and I actually think it's pretty good. It's not as good as his more well-known works. And again, it's a story about a family living in the 1800s who discover a mermaid, but she's a little more malevolent. She's got her sights on a young, handsome guy who. Well, I don't want to give the ending away. You have to read it for yourself. But let's just say that the guy's friends are trying to keep him away from her because they don't trust her. He may be going down to a watery death. But like I said, I'll leave the ending open for you to read for yourselves. In Greek mythology, you hear of water spirits. They're usually referred to as nymphs. Although nymphs are nature spirits, they're usually minor goddesses that live not only in the water, but they live in the woods and trees. But they live in the water as well. As a matter of fact, sometimes the water spirits, the water nymphs, are sometimes called naiads. There's a group of them that live in the ocean that are sons of Poseidon, and they're referred to as the Nereids. And yeah, so there's one really great story involving a water nymph in a really great epic, the Argonautika. This is the story of the voyage of Argo, or Jason and the Argonauts. There's an episode in this story that's really kind of interesting. Heracles was part of the Argo adventure, and he had a young little protege with him who he loved very much. His name was Hylas, a very handsome young man. And while they're rowing on I don't know if they had crossed the Mediterranean into the Black Sea by this point. I'm not really sure. But while they're rowing, Heracles was so strong he broke his oar, and they had to stop at a little island for him to repair the oar, get a new tree trunk to knock down. Meanwhile, Hylas goes looking for fresh water, and while he's looking, this beautiful nymph sees him, and she falls madly in love with him and says, "I must have him." And so as he gets close to the pool of water where she lives and puts in his pitcher or his vase, she grabs hold of him and pulls him under, and there's nothing he can do about it. But she keeps him alive underwater, of course, and Heracles doesn't know where he is. And Heracles is looking around and calling his name, and Hylas is underwater shouting, "I'm here, I'm down here," but Heracles doesn't see him. It's kind of a horrific picture. I mean, if you could imagine him just under the water, and he sees Heracles looking this way, looking that way, and he's right there under the water, and he's saying, "I'm here," but of course Heracles can't see him. So Heracles is so distraught, and he leaves the expedition. He says, "Leave without me. I got to look for my little buddy Hylas." And so they leave him there, and he goes around shouting his name, but we doubt he's ever going to find him. But like I said, stories of water spirits are all over Europe. In Russia, in Slavic lands, they speak of a water spirit called the Rusalka, plural Rusalki, or in English we sometimes simply say Rusalkas. Rusalkas are interesting. Again, they're sometimes pictured as mermaids, but many times they're pictured as having legs, just like other water spirits. In this really great little book here, I didn't include this book on my video on Slavic, Finnish and Slavic mythology, books to read, unfortunately, but I'll include it here because I didn't include it here. It's Russian Folk Belief by Linda Ivanits, and it's a really scholarly book if you're interested in folk beliefs in Russia, mythological stories. And on the cover, she has a Rusalka, and here she's in typical mermaid fashion, but like I said, many times they're pictured as having legs, and they're also kind of dangerous spirits. There's been all kinds of movies. I've seen movies based on Rusalkas where they're really rather dangerous. You shouldn't go near them. They'll lure you to the bottom of the lakes and streams that they live in, and they have this weird habit sometimes of tickling you to death. Rusalkas are freaks. But they say, I also read elsewhere that they may not all be dangerous. That may be more of a recent notion. They're very old. People believed in them for a very long time. And It's believed they may have been spirits of fertility at one point that may have been a little bit more benevolent. Uh, in mythology and in anthropology, whenever you come across spirits that you're not sure of what their function is, just say they're fertility spirits. But they may have been. And in this book and in other sources, they're sometimes described not as pagan spirits but as souls of dead women. It's believed that if a young woman killed herself, for example, their spirit is seen as unclean because killing yourself is a sin, and also they didn't receive last rites, so they become these water spirits. So in this case, they're basically spirits of the dead. So that's how come sometimes Rusalkas are seen as unclean spirits of the dead, because they haven't received, because either they killed themselves, or I guess because they didn't get last rites. Sometimes they're seen as murder victims, although why they would become water spirits for being murdered, I don't know. That's no fault of their own, but sometimes there are. And sometimes in Russian folk belief, there's something called Rusalka Week, where it's believed that part of the year they leave the water and they climb trees and they sit in the trees and they sing songs and do what Rusalkas do. There's even an opera based on them called Rusalka. I think Dvorak wrote that. I'm not sure. In northern-speaking areas, Germanic-speaking areas such as Switzerland and others, the water spirits there are called nixes. Nixes, or sometimes they're pronounced nixies, but according to this one book, they're referred to as nixes. I know it's kind of a funny name. And that there's an example of one story I really like where, again, they're kind of dangerous spirits too, but there's at least one story that actually has a pretty happy ending. Nixes, sometimes they leave their watery realm, lake or whatever they're living in, and sometimes they join festivals that humans are having, and they look the same as other women, except if you look at their petticoats, they're constantly dripping water. And there's this one story that according to this one nix came to a dance and fell in love with a young guy, and the guy fell in love with her, and she had the voice of water on the shore and hair with little bits of little drops of water that looked like diamonds, and he fell in love with her, and he was willing to live with her. Now this took place in Switzerland. There's a lake called Lake Zug, and that's where she lived, along with other nixes, and he was willing to live with her under this lake, and but he became homesick, and he became very sad because he left behind his family, his loved ones. So because the nix was a magical being, she was able to lift up his whole village and sink it into Lake Zug. But nobody drowned. They all lived there happily, only they lived in the bottom of the lake. So if you look carefully in the lake, when the water is still and you look past the reflection of the mountains and the clouds, you could see little church steeples and little lights at night and all kinds of interesting people moving about. I don't know, that story actually, I thought that was a cute story. There's again this great book on spirits, on water spirits. There's a really cute illustration here. Let me find it for you. Oh, here it is. Here's the nix with her lover, and underneath the waters of Lake Zug, and you could see the town that was sunken underneath. And one of the few happy endings in stories, in these kind of stories. There's now so far I've talked about spirits, water spirits as being women, but there are some that are male, and in Irish folklore, they speak of something called the merrow. Now, the merrow is what they call a merman, and it's called the merrow. And in Yeats's book, Folktales of the Irish Peasantry, he tells a really interesting story involving a merrow and a fisherman by the name of Jack Doherty, I think was his name, and it turns that Jack wanted to meet a merrow, and he got his wish, and he became friends with a merrow, and the merrow took him down to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to have dinner with him, and he didn't drown his friend. He was actually a good merman, and he just simply had dinner with him. But then he showed him his curiosities, he called them. And he took him to this place where there were these little lobster cages, or lobster pots, as the story calls them. And he says, "What's inside these lobster pots?" He goes, "Oh, and the merrow says, "Oh, they're the souls of dead sailors. Every time there's a storm, I go swimming around where the ship is sinking, and there's all these little souls who are cold and hungry, and I gather them up and I put them in these little soul cages." And and Jack was like, "Good heavens, they're these poor souls. They're trapped in these little cages." And the merrow's like, "Oh, they're okay. I feed them. I take care of them and everything." So then that night, Jack is trying to think of a way to free these spirits, because they shouldn't be cooped up in these little cages. Don't they have to go to heaven or wherever they got to go? So he comes up with a plan. He didn't think the merrow was going to let them go willingly. So he comes up with a plan. He goes, "Let's go drinking." So the two of them go down to the bottom of the Atlantic where the merrow lives, and they have kind of a little drinking contest. And luckily, Jack brought along this really powerful stuff, and the two of them drink away, and Jack made sure that his was more diluted, and sure enough, the merrow got drunk, and he was able to sneak off to where the soul cages were, and he turned them over and let the little souls fly out wherever they had to go, and that's how he freed the souls. There's an interesting. I have another book here that's really cool. That's really wonderful. I bought this many years ago, actually. It's Faeries. It's Faeries, and it illustrates these beautiful illustrations it's by Brian Froud and Alan Lee. Alan Lee is a wonderful illustrator, and in here he has an example of a merrow. There's the merrow. He actually looks kind of scary and fierce here, not the friendly spirit that Jack befriends in the merrow in the Irish story. And if the soul cages at all sounds a little familiar, you might remember this CD here by Sting called The Soul Cages. And Sting actually knew of this story. It's apparently not only Irish, it's a British story, and Sting liked it, and he referred to that story as inspiration for the title of the CD he made, The Soul Cages. So it's a pretty good CD if you're interested. Okay then, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you like and subscribe, and until next time.